Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with news that will disappoint anybody who believes escaping to Antarctica will free them from the outbreak of a disease or other disaster such as zombies. After a year, Antarctica has finally shown cases, specifically on the Chilean base where 36 people were diagnosed with the CCP virus. It mostly consists of army personnel, but also 10 civilians. This means that the final continent on Earth has been hit by the virus and it is now officially everywhere. Every continent, over 77 million cases, over 1.7 million deaths, and many countries reporting thousands currently infected. This means that across the world, despite everything that has happened, it continues to spread, and this makes the next piece of news even more important than ever before. As we mentioned last week, the chances of a vaccine being approved this week were considerably higher than you'd expect. This was Moderna's vaccine. Moderna was considered the better alternative than some of the others that were being offered. That was down to the fact that it could be transported and stored in relatively standard refrigerated conditions. After last week's recommendation for emergency approval, the FDA has done just that. The approval is important as it means that the vaccine could begin to be distributed. The idea was that within the month of December, more than 20 million Americans could be given the dose, 30 million in January, and 50 million in February. That means in roughly 3 months, 100 million doses could be issued. No matter how you look at it, that is great news for America. The problem is that for the rest of the world, as much as 1/4 may not be able to get a vaccine until 2022. That means they may have to wait up to 2 years. That means we may wind up with reservoirs of the CCP virus being located in developing countries, and the delays in getting vaccines to those locations could theoretically lead to more mutations and developments, requiring modification, development, refinement, and then remanufacturing of the vaccine. The problem when it comes to Moderna's vaccine is that they've never actually made a vaccine themselves. Instead, they're outsourcing large parts of the process, bringing them back to their primary facility, and then finalizing the vaccine there for distribution. This means that there's a lot of moving parts that have to be carefully balanced and controlled, especially when we're talking about quality control. This means that Moderna's vaccine, whilst at the moment the better option, also has a lot more hurdles to overcome to be successful. Further to that piece of vaccine news, it's worth knowing just how many vaccines have already been issued in the weeks since the initial emergency approval was given for Pfizer's vaccine. 1.1 million vaccines have been distributed in that time. In that time, 3 allergic reactions have been recorded, and none of those were fatal, none of them were long-lasting, and none of them had severe impact. It was a relatively minor instance of discomfort and disquiet. Over the same time frame, as you see clearly identified in this image, 90,000 people have died in America alone. And we've already given you the current statistics for the world, both those who are infected and those who have died. Consider these 2 comparable images. 3 allergic reactions in 1.1 million vaccinations. 1.744 million deaths and nearly 80 million current cases. That is the risk versus benefit comparison to make when you are looking at vaccines in this particular instance. People who say there's reason to be concerned about the vaccine are talking out of their ass. Those who say they have reservations, on the other hand, have a valid argument, primarily that the availability of vaccines is a concern, distribution's another one, and the nature of what's occurring means you should probably wait until the appropriate time, which means availability and refinement of the vaccines. But there's no reason not to take it if it is offered and or available. There's a big distinction between taking your time and going with it and those who are simply refusing it out of fear and paranoia. Consider the statistics we've given you and the fact that it is taking time to bring vaccines to market and then distribute them effectively. People who are acting in an irresponsible manner are being punished as a result because we have no better means of trying to limit the spread. This is practically universal across the world, where an 18-year-old teenager, a college student, was jailed for breaking the CCP virus laws. They were to serve 4 months in prison. Unfortunately, that punishment has been reduced to 2 months. The argument was that the punishment was too harsh, and that they were sorry and seeking the forgiveness of the people of the Cayman Islands. They don't seem to have understood that their actions have repercussions, and this is increasingly true of the law. What has happened is that they were supposed to serve 4 months in prison after they did not follow the 14-day quarantine period. This quarantine period exists to ensure people are not infected and spread it, especially to countries that have had success in limiting the spread and in some cases, like New Zealand, eradicating it. The teenager knew what was required, and the reason why she showed up and broke the laws in the Cayman Islands was for lack of future planning. Specifically, having arrived on a Friday and needing to be somewhere there on the Sunday, despite there being a 14-day quarantine period. They had to knowingly remove the tracking bracelet from their wrist. Then they attended a social event, and there they were picked up by the police, who knew that that's where she's most likely to have gone. For someone who was going to college, you would think that becoming an adult, they would start exercising better discretion and making decisions knowing that they would bear the consequences of these. Yet despite that, they chose to ignore them, and now they've been shown leniency. This is in a country, or more specifically a territory, of 65,000 people who have had 316 infections and 2 deaths. But the catch is, they have had no local transmissions for 6 months. That means that their measures to ensure people quarantine and are not infected have been not just successful, but compared to many other countries, exceptionally successful. As a pre-med student, you would think that they would have begun to understand not just the way diseases work, but why public policies, and particularly public health policies, are made the way they are, and to understand what is and is not effective. Let's try and take an example of where limitations have not been put in place effectively, and the CCP virus has been allowed to spread without control. California, and specifically beginning to look at Los Angeles, is a good example. In this state and in the county, there is no capacity for any more people in any ICU. There have also been 379 more deaths. That is, 1 person is dying every half hour, or 2 per an hour. Those numbers are both tragic and earth-shattering. In fact, they're record-breaking. This surge comes on the heels of California trying to get on top of the spread of the disease. And remember, California, being part of the United States of America, theoretically has better medical services facilities and staff available than the Cayman Islands, and this is why places like the Cayman Islands have such strict controls in place. They can't afford to have happen there what is happening in California. As is noted in this particular article, if you were to treat California as its own country, it would have the third highest daily case count. That's more than the United Kingdom, India, France, or Italy. It's only just below Brazil, and further down from America as a total. This situation is being somewhat counteracted by the issuing of the Pfizer vaccine to frontline medical staff, and there's nearly 400,000 doses being distributed in California as a result of this sudden surge. The surge has largely been explained as a result of the Thanksgiving holiday and concerns that it may lead to just as much of an explosive change through Christmas if people follow the same actions, that is, mass migration within the state and across the country, people moving the disease and infecting others, interacting in social situations, and now tying up ICU beds that are needed for those who require ventilation and other intensive support because they have been infected with the CCP virus. While on the topic of the vaccine, we should mention one of the other reasons why people have hesitancy in using it, that is, religious reasons. For the most part, there are very few religions that have specifically stated that vaccines are not okay. Often it's a matter of interpretation by either individuals or particular, specific, regional religious leaders. In this instance, though, we can say the national head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, has said the CCP virus vaccines are okay, even if the research involved fetal tissue, which in and of itself is something of a misnomer and myth, but we'll touch on that shortly. The important initial news is that for the global population of Catholics, the head of the church has just said, the vaccine is fine and you should take it. The decision has been, through the rather impressive mental gymnastics, justified with the following quote: "When ethically irreproachable COVID-19 vaccines are not available, it is morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in their research and production process." This should, in theory, mean that things like the varicella, rubella, and measles vaccine, hepatitis A vaccine, and some specific rabies vaccines are all okay as well because they were developed by growing the virus in fetal embryo cells. The same thing is not true of these two CCP virus preparations, specifically because these work on RNA, and the RNA vaccine doesn't require any fetal cells, and they would probably be less efficient and effective. Rather, they can be grown in a variety of other cell types, primarily bacteria, but there are other options available. This means that, although it's nice that the Vatican is supporting the use of the CCP virus, their justification for why it would not be okay is less than good. And this is one reason why vaccine hesitancy is such an odd area. Other than the tinfoil hat-wearing loonies, there are people who have justifiable personal reasons, religion being a very strong example. The problem is many of the religious leaders that are involved in guiding these people don't know anything about the science, and so they make claims like this without needing to make these claims. Going from the mysteries of space in the form of God, we can go to the mysteries of space in the form of unexpected radio signals. We've previously heard about stories of unexpected signals coming from space, or at least purportedly coming from space. One apocryphal tale has a signal being detected, and that it turns out this signal was actually something of a prank being run by fellow researchers, who would, at specific times during another researcher's activities, turn on the microwave, which would cause the signal to be received, and the researcher in turn believed this to be communication from another planet, or at least another system. In the case of this research, it's coming from Proxima Centauri, that is the nearest sun to our own. The lack of published information makes this both very preliminary and rather difficult to describe in more detail. The information that we do have at this stage is that it is continuation of evidence gained from April and May of 2019. There is a very narrow radio frequency in which it is being detected. The detection itself is being run through a large telescope array in Australia called the Parkes Telescope. This was a facility associated with the Apollo projects, that is, those that went to the moon many decades ago. The interesting thing here is the signal is one not associated with any signals normally produced by Earth or Earth-based satellites. Add to this, the signal itself appears to be changing slightly, that could be possibly associated with the movement of a planet. Within Proxima Centauri, there are several possible planets that could either have life on it or life on a circling moon. This is the first major possible candidate for extraterrestrial communication since 1977. Of course, there's also the possibility that this is simply cosmic background noise being generated by something relatively uneventful and uninteresting. What would be interesting is to ask these aliens, if we could communicate with them, if they also had a god who created them. While it's possible that God may have created the universe, it's less and less likely the more we learn about the universe. If you really want to learn a little bit more, look up to the sky this week. What you'll see is Jupiter and Saturn nearly right on top of each other, if not on top of each other by the time this video goes live. This is as close as they have been for 800 years. You don't need a telescope to see it, as it's visible through the naked eye. The advantage to this is that no matter where on Earth you are, you can see it happening. Although you need to be looking up at the sky about sunset and then for up to an hour afterwards. If you look any later than that, they won't be visible, and any earlier than that, and it'd likely be too bright for you to be able to see it. Simply look towards the western sky as the sun sets, and you should see these two very bright spots very obviously. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you might have below.